Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. In 2022, U.S. Army Colonel Charles Young was posthumously promoted to brigadier general, a rank he likely would have advanced to during World War I. In 1917, he was the highest-ranking African-American officer in the U.S. Army. A veteran of the 1916 Mexican expedition, his name even appeared on a list of the campaign's officers that General John J. Pershing recommended for future brigade command. Then, months into World War I, he was controversially sidelined after failing a medical exam. And today we're going to examine his career and why he was sidelined during World War I. And we are joined by Dr. David Kilroy, author of For Race and Country, The Life and Career of Colonel Charles Young. Welcome, Dr. Kilroy, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Amanda. Delighted to be here.
Can you start us off with a brief biographical sketch of Charles Young's early years, say leading up to his appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point?
Okay, so Young was born to enslaved parents in Mayslick, Kentucky in 1864, toward the tail end of the American Civil War. His father, Gabriel, self-emancipated by enlisting in the 5th United States Colored Infantry. And so when the war was over, with money earned, bonus money from serving an extra year, the family moved across the river into Ripley, Ohio, bought some land, and this is where Charles Young grew up. He was the only son of Gabriel and Arminta, and he was their future, basically. So they put a lot of attention into his education and his upbringing. And Charles was an excellent student. I mean, he excelled in school. Ripley was a bustling town and a fairly progressive by the standards of the day in terms of race. So there was an integrated high school, and Charles excelled in that school. He was particularly good at languages. He learned both German and French, and he was also very musical. I played a number of instruments, including the piano. And these are two things I think that would characterize him throughout the rest of his life, right? A proficiency for language and a love of music. After graduation, he taught briefly in so-called colored school in Ripley, the elementary school. But then in 1883, he saw an ad in the Ripley Bee for the West Point entrance exam. And he took it. He finished second out of, I think there were 26 people who took the exam. The number one person turned down the invitation to take the place, and Congressman Alfonso Hart of the 12th District in Ohio put Charles Young's name forward. And so this is how he came to go to the military academy. I think for him, this was basically satisfied two things coming out of his upbringing, right? His father, of course, had served in the Civil War. He was a proud member of the GIR. And I think, military service and patriotism was very important to Charles Young because of his father's experience. And then, of course, on the flip side, you have his mother, his mother and grandmother actually were both literate, right? Which is obviously unusual for enslaved people in this era. And so they had, emphasized education to him. And so West Point was an opportunity to get a good free education. And once again, it's something that he valued throughout the course of his life. There is one other influence, I think, from his early life that's important, and that's John Parker. And John Parker was a former enslaved person who had bought his own freedom and moved north before the end of the Civil War, and had been very active in the Underground Railroad, and had done very well in terms of building a foundry business, owned a large house, had a big library. Young was his mentee. He spent a lot of time at his house reading books. And I think from Parker and from his own family's experience, he got this, deep sense of commitment to pursuing racial equality and advancing the cause of Black people in post-Civil War America.
Now, when he enters West Point, Young is not the first African American to attend the academy, but can you tell us about his experience at West Point?
Okay, so there were 9 Black candidates admitted into West Point during the Reconstruction era. Young, as you say, was one of these. He was one of 3 who would graduate. In that sense, he stands out. But his experience, and I think it should be pointed out, by the way, that when Young graduated in 1889, he was the last black graduate from West Point for 47 years. There would not be another black graduate until 1936. It's also kind of significant that that person was Benjamin Davis Jr., son of Benjamin O. Davis, who Charles Young had actually mentored from the rank of NCO to become a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army. So there's a direct connection between Young and the next black graduate from West Point 47 years later. So his experience in West Point, it was complicated. He would look back throughout his career and repeatedly comment that West Point had made him a spit and polish officer, a consummate professional, and he valued the education he had received there. But he would write to Young received letters all the time from young black men seeking advice about future careers, particularly in the military. And in 1918, which was a low point in his life for Charles Young, which I think we'll get to, he wrote back to one letter writer warning him against a career in the military, and particularly considering West Point. He described it as a dog's life for the whole time he was there. And there's plenty of evidence that Young faced tremendous discrimination and ostracization while he was at West Point. Now, John Alexander, who was one of the other three graduates, was there for the first 3 years that Young was there, but Young actually spent 5 years at West Point. So there were 2 years when he had no other person really who would talk to him or engage him, right? He would write that he would speak to the German bootblacks in German just so he would have someone to talk to, right? He wasn't even hazed because hazing would involve, human interaction, right? He was pretty much excluded from his class. Now, he did later write that he found some friends among the fellow white cadets and some mentors among the white faculty. But generally speaking, I think the evidence is pretty clear. The academy didn't want him there and sought to, like the other black cadets, find a way to force them out, right? He had more demerits than anyone in his class. He was kept back academically. He wasn't allowed to graduate with his class. He graduated alone in the summer after his class had graduated. And so, I think the evidence is pretty clear that there was hostility to his presence there, which I think foreshadowed a lot of what would happen in his career in the military. But the fact that he graduated, I think, speaks to his perseverance and his determination and his character in many ways. So it was a difficult time for him.
Well, that persistence definitely pays off. And he's commissioned a second lieutenant in 1889. Can you walk us through his career leading up to 1917?
Sure. After graduation from West Point, Young became only the third black officer to earn a commission in the post-Civil War U.S. Army. The other two were John Alexander, who I mentioned, who had graduated just a couple of years before Young. Alexander would die of a brain aneurysm shortly after earning his commission. And the third one was Henry Ocean Flipper, who had graduated a few years before both of them. And Flipper's case is quite infamous because he was court-martialed under very suspect circumstances and, forced out of the Army. So Young really spent most of his military career up until his forced retirement in 1917 as the highest ranking, and for a long time, the sole black commissioned officer in the United States Army. And the one other long-serving black officer in this period was Benjamin O. Davis, who I mentioned before. Young had mentored as an NCO, and he took the officer exam in 1901 when the Army expanded, during a period of Army expansion. And it's kind of ironic because, of course, Davis would go on to become the first black general in the U.S. Army, something which, of course, eludes Young during his career. But that happened during World War II, in a different time, of course, than Young's time in the military. So from the time of his commission, really through much of his career, Young struggled with a lot of the same things which he had faced at West Point, right? Discrimination, hostility, ostracization from his fellow officers. Young would serve most of his career with the 9th Cavalry. He also spent some time toward the end of his career with the 10th Cavalry. These were two of the four so-called Buffalo Soldier regiments, right? The black regiments created out of the USAT at the end of the Civil War. There were originally 6, and then they were pared down to 4. But as was the practice during the Civil War, these regiments, although they were black regiments, were exclusively officered by white officers. And so Young, was an anomaly to his superiors, right? Somebody who didn't fit in. And certainly to his fellow officers, they made no effort to include him for the most part, right? There was, Young tells stories about social ostracization and how he dealt with it a lot of time alone in his quarters. And because of his professionalism, saw himself, kind of outside the general camaraderie of the NCOs and the conscripted ranks. So it was a difficult time. The other factor, I think, which shapes his career is that the Army really wanted to avoid, in the same way that the Army took the black regiments and largely posted them out west, where they were away from large white, concentrations of white population. The Army took Young and basically put him on detached service for as often as the law would allow, right, so that he would be away from his regiment, and these kind of awkward and oftentimes confrontational interactions with his white peers in the officer corps were avoided, right? So he spent a good portion of his career teaching military tactics at Wilberforce University in Ohio, which is a black college in Ohio. He actually, made this his home. He spent time as a military attaché in Haiti and in Liberia. He was put in command of black troops who were sent on park service in California, right? So for a time he served as acting superintendent of Sequoia and General Grant National Parks. And, all of these things together kept him away from regimental duty for a good portion of his career. He did have some significant moments in his career with his regiments, right? So he served in the Philippines in 1903 during the insurrection. This was his first experience, commanding troops in the field during combat, and he excelled in this and won commendations for his service. And he also served in the Punitive expedition in Mexico, which I think we're going to get to. He had a second tour in the Philippines as well. I think one of his big disappointments professionally was missing out on the Spanish-American War, right, where the 9th Cavalry did serve in Cuba. Young was once again put on detached service from his regiment. He was put in charge of training. He had a temporary wartime commission as a major in a volunteer unit from Ohio, but they were stuck stateside training throughout the whole conflict and never saw any combat. So I think the Army didn't know what to do with Charles Young, right? And they sent him to these various places. I think the irony of this is that wherever he went, he excelled, right? He really demonstrated prowess, right? So in the park service, both from U.S. government officials and from people in that region of California, he won significant accolades for the work that he achieved above and beyond what others had done in the same capacity. And in Haiti and in Liberia, I mean, what he achieved was remarkable, right? In Haiti, he rode the whole island on horseback, created the first map in the Military Intelligence Division archives of Haiti. He wrote a Creole dictionary, which was something, French-English Creole dictionary, which was something incredibly unusual. And he wrote an extensive report of the island, right, for the U.S. military, which ironically the U.S. would use during the occupation in 1915 of Haiti, and which would serve as kind of a backlash on what Young would later try to do in Liberia. But in Liberia too, he commanded their Liberian frontier force, trained it, recruited it, went in the field with them. But he also demonstrated real skill as a diplomat, and of course that's why the State Department requests that he goes back there in 1919. So, I think it's in spite of the expectations that the military had for him. Young actually, proves that he is incredibly capable, and then continues to rise through the ranks as a consequence.
So during the 1916 Mexican expedition, Young clearly distinguishes himself, and his regimental commander even praises his ability to work with white officers. General Pershing, as we mentioned earlier, puts his name on a list of future brigade commanders. So he's clearly on the path to future promotion to probably becoming a brigadier general. Then the United States enters World War I in April 1917, just a few months before Young is up for promotion to colonel. So what happens at this point, and What derails his career at this very critical moment?
Okay, so Young's service in Mexico is important on so many levels, right? At this point has risen to the rank of major and has just returned to regimental duty. Is now with the 2nd Squadron of the 10th Cavalry, and when Pancho Villa's raid takes place against Columbus, and the 10th are very heavily involved in the pursuit of Villa and his men into Mexico. So Young is second in command to Colonel William Brown on this expedition, and at various times in Brown's absence, Young takes command of all of the 10th Cavalry in the field. So this means he's commanding white officers, right? Something the U.S. Army had hoped to avoid would happen, right? Is happening here, and once again, despite expectations, Young excels, right? As you point out. He comes to the attention of Brigadier General Pershing, to the point that Pershing will put his name forward among a list of officers from the punitive expedition who are well suited to brigade command. In the field, Young will once again see combat, and he proved in Mexico that basic mythology which the Army had and the country at large had about African American soldiers was completely false, right? This idea that Black soldiers would only follow white officers, or that white officers couldn't follow commands from Black officers. These were pervasive ideas in the U.S. military at this time, and part of the reason why there was so much hostility to Young's presence. And Young proved all of this to be, completely bogus during his time in Mexico. So it's important that Pershing recognized him in this way. In fact, Pershing sat on the examiner board for his exam promotion to lieutenant colonel while in Mexico. So, Young, I think, proved in Mexico beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was among the best officers at his rank in the U.S. Army. And I think Pershing reinforces this then in his commendation. And as you say, the punitive expedition kind of peters out in World War I, very much on the horizon. Even before the U.S. entered the war, it's very clear to people like Charles Young and others in the U.S. military that the U.S. is going to be engaged in this conflict at some level. So the expectations are there that Young will go on to serve in this conflict. And like all ambitious officers, the opportunity for advancement is clear, right? Young will, after his punitive expedition, Young will go back to the United States with the 10th Cavalry. He will be posted to Fort Huachuca in Arizona, and will for a time serve as the base commander there in Fort Huachuca. And he sits the exam for promotion to the rank of full colonel. And during this exam, his examining board recommends him for promotions, that he's fully fitted for promotion to the next rank. But the medical examiner detects high blood pressure and recommends that Young go for further tests to Letterman Hospital, which he does. And this all happens pretty much at the same time that the United States enters World War I. Right? So Young is deeply frustrated by this. He's sitting in a hospital, getting a battery of tests, claiming that he's fully fit. And meanwhile, the mobilization for war is beginning, and so he's chomping at the bit to be involved in this. There's a second, the Western Division will conduct a second examination. Once again, Young is recommended for promotion, but this time the findings of the medical examiners are clear, indicating that he has significantly high blood pressure and chronic nephritis, right? So what's often referred to as Bright's disease. But once again, I think the board recommended that despite this, that he still be considered for active duty, given the need that the Army had for experienced officers. They were at a premium, obviously. The U.S. Army was small, was going to mobilize very quickly an expeditionary force for Europe. So, the medical issues were there, they were real, but the examiners felt that Young, needed to be maintained on active duty. But Young even, wants to protest the medical findings, claiming that he's fully fit. And he starts a letter writing campaign and writes to everyone who will take his communications, right? So, he's stuck in his hospital waiting for some clarity. What he doesn't know is that behind the scenes, there's kind of a political development taking place, right? The Secretary of War Newton Baker has been contacted by President Wilson about Young's case, and the The origins of this are that Young, while he was commanding Fort Huachuca, had a young white lieutenant had been assigned to the 10th Cavalry, a guy called Albert Dockery. So Albert Dockery was from Mississippi, complained to his senator, John Sharp Williams. He found it, in his words, quote unquote, intolerable to serve under a black officer. And Williams wrote to President Wilson. And of course, the context here is that I think, as most people know, the Wilson White House had a reputation for reversing any kind of progressive efforts toward promoting greater racial equality in the U.S., right? And Wilson was immediately sympathetic to Williams' letter and to Dockery's position, and inserted himself into this issue. Newton Baker, who was, by the standards of the Wilson administration, at least a progressive on the issue of race, Baker's initial inclination was to tell Dockery, resign or do your duty, right? But Wilson put subtle pressure on Baker to resolve the issue in Dockery's favor. So, it's quite remarkable the President of the United States would get involved in a fairly minor issue like this that the War Department was capable of resolving themselves. So Baker wrote back to Wilson that, Young is not well, and he may not be approved for further active duty, so the issue might be moot. And sure enough, all of this happened in June. In July, then the medical findings determined that Young should be retired on medical grounds because he was unfit for further service. And this is what happened. He was retired at the rank of colonel, which I think, he had essentially achieved regardless in the months leading up to this. I think the point here is basically say that I think the evidence is pretty clear that Young's career was derailed for political reasons. He likely would have served had he not been, under all other things being equal, had he not been black, he would have continued to serve in World War I. He was, one of the top officers, according to the man who would command the U.S. forces in Europe. So I can't see why the Army wouldn't have made an exception given their need at this time. So the retirement really has, and of course, this was recognized, I think, by people at the time. It was recognized by Young, and it was certainly recognized by his supporters in the black community who were outraged, right? The black press was outraged. W. Du Bois kind of led the charge. Du Bois was a good friend of Young's. Du Bois called it a dodge and a clear, effort to avoid his promotion to brigadier general. And Young himself protested. He wrote letters to Pershing. He wrote to Theodore Roosevelt, who he had a relationship with. He wrote to several other officers who he had served with throughout his career. And then, of course, he famously undertook this 500-mile horseback ride to Washington, D.C. from his home in Wilberforce, hoping to, Young's view was this was a bureaucratic snafu in the Army. If the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, knew about this, then, he would clear things up and put him back on active duty. And so that's why he rode to D.C. to get an audience with Newton Baker to prove his physical fitness. And Baker did sit down with him, but by that point, the political intervention of the president ensured that there was going to be no revisiting of this issue. And so Young was left deeply frustrated and angry.
Yeah, earlier I was going to be prepared to play devil's advocate and say, well, these medical issues certainly were present, so maybe that was the reason that he was sidelined. But I think it's pretty clear after you unravel it a little bit more that it is incredibly political. There certainly are a lot of other officers that make it overseas that are not fit for duty, including a number of general officers. So very unfortunate for Young. So you mentioned a little bit about how he responds. And can you tell us any more about this trip that he takes to go meet Newton Baker?
Yeah, the horseback ride is kind of among, young aficionados and Young's followers. It's taken on kind of a mythological status, right? There's very little actual documentary evidence, about the ride. There's a couple of documents point out the places he stopped and watered his horse and spent the night and so forth. But basically, over several days, he rides all the way to D.C. To prove as a cavalry officer that he has all the physical attributes required to continue serving the field. And to a certain degree, it's a publicity stunt, right? Because the black press pick up on it and there's significant coverage of it. And by the time he arrives in D.C., there's significant crowds gathered, ready to greet him. Young was a figure of particular renown in the Black community, right? He was among the most prominent African Americans of his era. So he had celebrity status to a degree. So there were large crowds who gathered with him and met him when he came to D.C. and he rode all the way to the War Department and he got his audience with Newton Baker. But as I mentioned, by that point the die was cast, right? There was going to be no revisiting. But Young didn't know that, right? I think this is the thing about Charles Young, that some of his critics charged him that he was naive, right? That he didn't see through the racism which shaped the thinking of so many of the people he interacted with professionally. And I think to some degree that may be true, but I think the other thing about Young was that he truly believed in the idea that if you proved yourself professionally and in terms of trustworthiness and so forth, that you could overcome these prejudices, right? That this is all it would take. And this is why he put so much into, this. He would sign, when people wrote to him, asked for photographs, he would send photographs back, and he would write "for race and country" on there. Young was very clear that he was serving his country, but that in doing so, he was advancing the cause of racial equality. And he believed wholeheartedly that the prejudices which he'd experienced as an individual at West Point and throughout his Army career could be overcome with success, right? And so the horseback ride was really the last effort to show that, hang on a second, I have all of the attributes here. Treat me on the basis of my career and my current physical standing. And he really believed that Newton Baker might make a difference. I think that's why some of the critics argue he was naive in that last act.
So historians, we don't always like to engage in what ifs, but let's imagine that he did serve during World War I. Given the segregation of the military and the American Expeditionary Force's disposition towards Black units, what role might he have played overseas, or do you think he even would have made it overseas?
Right. So at the time of his retirement, as the Expeditionary Force was being put together, Young and his supporters would have expected that had he not been retired, he would have gone to France and he would have likely been promoted to rank of brigadier general, and that he would have led and represented the Black contribution to the American war effort, right? 380,000 Black Americans volunteered or enlisted for service during World War I. Very few of them ever saw combat. I think it's well documented, right? Those that did make it to Europe either served in stevedore regiments or were farmed out to serve under the French military. The two regiments which Young served his career at, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, neither of them served in Europe during World War I. The 9th Cavalry was sent to the Philippines, and the 10th Cavalry spent the war in New Mexico on the Mexican border. So I guess the point is to say that, playing devil's advocate, had Young not been retired, it's likely that he would have spent the war in New Mexico or in the Philippines. And so to a certain degree, the controversy about his potential for promotion or commanding white officers in the field and so forth that caused so much of the debate around his retirement might have been moot, right? Essentially, the Wilson administration made a blanket effort to avoid having Black Americans, whether they were brigadier generals or privates, having any visible role to play in the American war effort. And so I think Young and his supporters came to see his retirement as just one of a number of egregious kind of mistreatments of Black Americans who were wanting to do their patriotic duty and serve the United States during World War I. So it's impossible to know, but even if he had served, maybe he would have come out of the war disappointed with the way he was treated.
He is recalled to active duty, though. And can you tell us about that and then his final years of service?
So he's briefly recalled actually before the war ends, just couple of months before the armistice, and he's sent to Camp Grant in Illinois to command so-called colored development units. And this is partly, I think, a political ploy by the Wilson administration because they faced so much flack over his retirement, and also for the mistreatment of Black volunteers and the conditions and the morale in Camp Grant were incredibly poor when Young was sent there to bring some order to that encampment. But when the war ended, then he was once again, placed in retirement. In 1919, he was recalled again to active duty and sent to Liberia. Now, for his supporters, this was an outrage, right? Du Bois in particular lambasted the United States government, saying, how could this man be unfit to serve in the trenches in Europe, but yet he's fit enough to return to the west coast of Africa, where he actually got the Blackwater fever, which caused his medical conditions in the first place. So, there was a lot of skepticism about about why the U.S. was calling him back into service. The reason for it, though, is that the U.S. State Department was trying to close a deal on a loan to Liberia. This loan had predated the war, but the war had interrupted negotiations, and Young was considered to have been, in his first posting in Liberia, the most effective advocate of American interests and the person who was most capable of winning over Liberian politicians to pursuing the American loan. And so the State Department actually requested the War Department to post him as military attaché to Liberia. And once asked, Young was never going to say no. Right? Young, even though his friends like Du Bois and his wife Ada really didn't want him to go, Young saw it as his duty to go. He never questioned that issue. Even though in that intervening period between, say, Camp Grant and Liberia, Young, for the first time in his life, became quite political. Right? He went on a speaking tour for the NAACP. He spoke out against racism in America. Wrote privately about his bitterness over his retirement and his mistreatment throughout his time in the military. But when he was called to service, like the highly trained and disciplined officer he went. And so, but I think he was in his last years still pretty disillusioned. The situation in Liberia was not good. The war had ravaged the economy, and I mentioned earlier that Young's maps of Haiti had been instrumental in the effective U.S. occupation of Haiti in 1915. The Haitian occupation actually really damaged America's reputation in places like Liberia, right? The Liberian government looked at the Haitian occupation and said, hang on a second, are we next, right? And so Young was going back into a very different environment in 1919 than he had been in 1915. It was a very frustrating time for him. He found some solace in his own pursuits, right? He wrote a lot of music and studied African music. He did a lot of kind of anthropological work. He was very interested became very interested in African history. And when he was sent to Nigeria on a fact-finding mission, right, the U.S. sent him down to Lagos on a fact-finding mission. He traveled into the interior of the country, into Kano. He was very interested in seeing, pre-colonial evidence of pre-colonial African civilization. And so it was partly on a U.S. sanctioned trip, but partly of his own accord that he was in Nigeria. And this is where he became ill, and he returned to Lagos, was hospitalized, and he passed away at the beginning of 1922, January 1922. And he was buried with full military honors by the British in a military cemetery in Lagos. So his career kind of ended in tragedy, I think. He was disillusioned, disappointed, somewhat forgotten, and of course died tragically away from his family in 1922.
We mentioned earlier that he was posthumously promoted to brigadier general in 2022, but I don't think many Americans know who he is, though. What is his legacy, and how can people learn more about him?
So, yeah, I think Young is a forgotten figure in American history. But in the immediate aftermath of his death, he was not forgotten. In fact, his wife and his supporters campaigned for him to be disinterred and returned to the United States to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And this happened in 1922. When he returned to the U.S., huge crowds greeted the boat arriving in New York Harbor. There was a huge ceremony in New York. The body, Young's body, was went on a train to Philadelphia, where more crowds turned out, and then to D.C. It took several hours for the funeral cortege to move through the streets of Washington, D.C. Thousands of people turned out. The so-called colored schools closed for the day. And Young was only the fourth person ever to get a funeral service in the amphitheater in Arlington. The others were the two Confederate soldiers buried as part of the reconciliation efforts post-Civil War, and the unknown soldier from World War I. So this was a huge event, and it spoke to the importance of Young at the time, his significance as a figure in Black America. And he would remain a figure of prominence and importance in Black America for years to come, right? Through 1948, across the country, his birthday was a day of national celebration. There were schools and American Legion posts named after him. In fact, he has more American Legion posts, at least at the time that I published this book. There were more Charles Young American Legion posts than any other single individual in the United States. So he was remembered for a long time. I think post-World War II, his memory starts to fade. In American military circles, particularly among Black Americans in the military, Young's memory never fades away. Right? He remains a point of inspiration. So you can look from people from Benjamin O. Davis Sr. to Colin Powell, all will talk about Young as an inspirational figure. I know in writing this book, I heard from a lot of serving and Black soldiers and from a number of Black veterans about the importance that Young holds in their lives. But beyond those certain circles, Young's memory definitely faded. I'd like to think that in publishing this book back in 2003, it was the starting point of a kind of a Young revival. Several other books have been published about aspects of his life since then. There's been kind of renewed interest. His home in Wilberforce has been converted into a national park, and the National Park Service has done a lot to revive his memory, particularly with regard to his service out in California. Groups like the fraternity Omega Psi Phi, which he was an honorary member of, have done an awful lot to promote his memory, including commemorative events around the horseback ride. So a lot has been done. And then, of course, just a couple of years ago, Governor Bishar in Kentucky proposed his posthumous promotion and appealed to the Biden administration to bring this about. So there has been a kind of a Young revival in recent years, more published about him, more written about him, but he's still fairly obscure to most Americans. So, I think somebody who deserves significantly more attention. There was an interesting op-ed, I think it was in the Cleveland Plain Dealer just a couple of months ago, about how, with all of these, the discussions about renaming military bases currently named after Confederate generals or officers, that somebody like Charles Young would be a worthy individual to be honored if any of these places were to be renamed. And I would agree. I think this is somebody who's, whose significance, not just in military terms, but in larger historical terms, is undervalued.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kilroy, for joining us today.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.